For decades, the world has seen André Rieu as something almost unreal. The man with the golden violin, the eternal smile, the conductor who turned classical music into celebration, romance, and joy for millions. On stage, André Rieu never looks tired, never uncertain, never broken. But there are moments the audience does not see. Moments when the music stops. Moments when applause fades. Moments when a father is left alone with the quiet weight of his own legacy. And it was in one of those moments that André Rieu was seen in tears, not because of a failed concert, not because of illness, not because of financial loss, but because of his son's unexpected transformation. The burden of a perfect legacy. To the outside world, André Rieu built the dream life every artist wants. Sold-out arenas, a global orchestra, a brand so powerful that his name alone fills seats. But inside that success lived a silent expectation that followed him home. Because when you become a global symbol of excellence, people assume one thing above all else. Your children will continue what you built. They assume it is natural. They assume it is an honor. They assume it is destiny. Few ever ask whether it is a choice. A son born into applause. From the moment his sons were born, they were never just children. They were André Rieu's sons. Every move they made was watched. Every interest analyzed. Every decision quietly compared to the legend of their father. One son in particular, Marc Rieu, grew up surrounded by music so constant that silence itself felt unfamiliar. Violins, rehearsals, tour buses, concert halls. To many fans, it seemed obvious. Marc would step onto the stage one day and take his place beneath the lights. But reality was far more complicated. The transformation no one expected. Marc Rieu did not rebel. He did not explode into scandal. He did not publicly reject his father. Instead, he did something far more unsettling to a famous legacy. He quietly chose another path, not as a performer, not as a front-facing heir to the empire, not as the next André Rieu. And while the public saw this as a normal, even healthy decision, André Rieu felt something far deeper. Because for the first time, he had to face a truth most icons never prepare for. His greatest creation, his music, his empire, his legacy, was also a shadow his son had to escape. Why this broke André Rieu? The tears were not about disappointment. They were not about ego. They were not about control. They were about guilt. André Rieu realized something devastating. Everything that made him beloved by the world had quietly made his son's life heavier. Imagine growing up knowing your father fills stadiums, that strangers feel entitled to your future, that people already decided who you were supposed to become. Marc's transformation forced André Rieu to confront a painful question. Did my success give my son opportunities or take his freedom? That realization does not come with applause. It comes with silence. The moment the music couldn't help. André Rieu has always turned emotion into melody. Joy becomes waltz. Sadness becomes harmony. Love becomes orchestration. But this was different. There was no arrangement for this feeling. No conductor's baton that could bring control. No crescendo that led to resolution. His son was not failing. His son was not lost. His son was becoming himself. And for a father whose entire life had been defined by continuing tradition, this felt like both a loss and a victory at the same time. That contradiction is where the tears came from. The hidden cost of fame. HLLW stories often expose the part fame hides best. Not tragedy in headlines, but emotional erosion over time. André Rieu never wanted to trap his son, but fame does not ask permission before it follows your family home. Every successful parent in the public eye faces the same silent fear. What if my child feels they must either live up to me or disappear from me? Marc's transformation meant André Rieu had to accept something most legends resist. Legacy does not survive by replication. It survives by release. A father, not a maestro. In that moment of tears, André Rieu was no longer a maestro commanding an orchestra. He was simply a father realizing his child's life would not follow his score. And that realization hurts, even when it is right. Because letting go means accepting that your greatest influence may never be visible on stage. It may never receive standing ovations. It may never be praised by strangers. It may exist only in the quiet confidence of a child who chose their own life. What the world missed. Fans saw André Rieu's emotion and assumed sadness. But it was deeper than that. It was pride tangled with fear, love tangled with regret, acceptance tangled with loss. This was not a story about a son abandoning music. It was a story about a father finally understanding the weight of his own greatness and realizing that true love sometimes means stepping out of the spotlight so your child can find light of their own. For most of his life, André Rieu believed in continuity, not just in music, but in meaning. He believed that what you love deeply, you pass forward. That tradition is not a chain, but a gift. That building something beautiful means hoping someone you love will carry it further than you ever could. But what André Rieu learned, painfully, quietly, is that legacy does not always move forward in a straight line. Sometimes it turns away. The day André Rieu stopped conducting at home. On stage, André Rieu is absolute control. Every violinist waits for his cue. Every note bends to his intention. At home, with his son, there was no baton. When Marc Rieu made it clear that his life would not unfold under the same spotlight, André Rieu did not argue. He did not persuade. He did not threaten. But something inside him collapsed anyway. Because parents who love deeply often confuse two things: wanting the best for their child and believing the path that fulfilled them must also fulfill their child. Marc's transformation shattered that illusion. The fear André Rieu never voiced. The tears did not come from the choice itself. They came from what the choice represented. A question André Rieu never said out loud, but clearly felt. If my son walks away from this world, what does that say about the world I built? That question haunts every icon, whether they admit it or not. Was the life really joyful, or just spectacular? Was the applause nourishing or addictive? Did success expand the soul or quietly narrow it? Marc's decision forced André Rieu to examine his own life from the outside for the first time. When children become mirrors, fame allows you to avoid reflection for a long time. As long as crowds cheer, doubts stay quiet. As long as tickets sell, meaning feels secure. But children are mirrors you cannot turn away from. Marc did not accuse his father. He did not criticize his career. He did not reject music itself. He simply chose not to be consumed by it. And that terrified André Rieu more than rebellion ever could. Because rebellion can be dismissed as immaturity. Independence cannot. The weight of a name. For Marc Rieu, transformation was survival. Imagine introducing yourself and watching people's eyes change. Not because of who you are, but because of who your father is. Imagine every achievement being seen as inherited. Every failure seen as betrayal. Every choice measured against a legend you never asked to become. Marc did not abandon legacy. He redefined it. And in doing so, he taught André Rieu something no audience ever could. Why this hurt more than any criticism. André Rieu has been criticized before. Called commercial. Called sentimental. Called excessive. None of that made him cry. Because criticism attacks the artist. But this moment touched the man. It exposed a truth too raw for interviews. Even the most loving success can unintentionally suffocate the people closest to it. Marc's transformation wasn't a rejection of love. It was a demand for air. The silent redefinition of success. After the tears, something changed in André Rieu. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. Success no longer meant expansion. It meant balance. Legacy no longer meant continuation. It meant permission. He realized that if his son could live a full, peaceful life outside the spotlight, then perhaps the greatest thing André Rieu ever built was not an orchestra, but a family strong enough to choose differently. The HLLW truth no one likes to admit. Hollywood, fame, and public success sell one fantasy relentlessly. That being extraordinary is always a gift. HLLW exists because that fantasy is incomplete. Extraordinary lives create extraordinary pressure. Extraordinary success creates invisible debt. And extraordinary parents must eventually face an extraordinary reckoning. André Rieu's tears were not weakness. They were evolution. They marked the moment he stopped measuring his life by what followed him and started measuring it by what he could finally let go. A father's quiet victory. Marc Rieu's transformation did not diminish André Rieu's legacy. It humanized it. Because a man who allows his child to walk away from his shadow has achieved something far rarer than fame. He has proven that love outranks legacy. And that realization does not come with standing ovations. It comes in silence, with tears, and with acceptance. As André Rieu sat quietly in his home, no longer conducting his orchestra, but reflecting on his life's journey, something profound began to unfold within him. He wasn't just grappling with the shifting dynamics in his family. He was coming to terms with a deeper, more unsettling truth that the very legacy he had worked so hard to build could, in a sense, become a burden. The unseen struggles of a maestro. André Rieu has lived a life many would envy. His concerts are legendary, filled with grandeur, passion, and emotion. His ability to make classical music accessible and beloved to millions around the world is unparalleled. For decades, his name has been synonymous with joyful music, iconic waltzes, and the unmistakable image of him leading his orchestra in front of a sea of adoring fans. Yet behind the scenes, there's always been a quiet struggle that few people see. Fame, as bright and beautiful as it may appear, can also cast the longest shadows. And for a father like André Rieu, watching his son step away from the life he had imagined for him was like facing the very thing he had built with his own hands, his legacy, and realizing that it wasn't just something to be passed down. It was something that needed to be let go. The gift of freedom. When Marc Rieu made his decision to step away from the family legacy, it was a quiet rebellion, not a defiant rejection. He didn't shout his departure from the music world. He simply chose his own path. This wasn't about abandoning music or his family. It was about finding his own voice, one not drowned out by the expectations and achievements of his father. In many ways, Marc's transformation was a gift, not just to himself but to André. It was a silent permission to release the idea that legacy must always follow a single path. Marc's decision freed his father, too, from the prison of perfection that comes with being a legend. And in that freedom, André found peace. The weight of expectations. As a father, André Rieu always wanted the best for his children. He wanted them to experience the joy that music brought to him, the fulfillment of creating something beautiful and shared. But with his success came expectations, and those expectations weighed heavily on both of them. It's easy to look at the son of a legend and assume he'll follow in the same footsteps, live the same life, carry the same name. But what happens when that son doesn't want to walk the same path? What happens when, instead of being a mirror image of the father, the child seeks his own identity? André Rieu realized that while he could teach his son music, he could not teach him how to live his life. Music may have been the family's bond, but freedom, the freedom to choose, was the greatest gift he could offer Marc. And while it was painful at first to see his son turn away from the spotlight, it became clear that Marc was choosing a life not defined by his father's success, but by his own desire to be true to himself, letting go of control. For most of his life, André Rieu had been in control, not just of his orchestra, but of his own narrative. He had built a brand, a legacy, and an empire. His name was attached to everything he had accomplished. But as a father, he began to understand that his greatest achievements weren't the ones that earned him fame, but the ones that allowed his son to find his own path. Letting go of control was the hardest thing André Rieu ever had to do, and yet it was the most necessary. He had spent his life building something to be proud of, but in doing so, he hadn't realized how much of his life had been shaped by the need to be perfect, not just as an artist, but as a father. And now, his son's decision to step away from the music world forced André to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. His legacy was not about him anymore. It was about Marc and Marc's ability to live authentically. A new kind of legacy. As André Rieu's tears flowed, they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of understanding, of release. He realized that legacy doesn't have to be inherited. It doesn't have to be lived out in the footsteps of those who came before. Sometimes, the greatest legacy a father can leave is the freedom to choose a different path. Marc Rieu's transformation wasn't a rejection of the family's legacy. It was an embrace of a new kind of legacy. One built not on the shoulders of a father's success, but on the individual choices and journeys that make each person unique. And in that realization, André understood something vital. He didn't have to carry the weight of his success alone. His son didn't need to follow in his footsteps to honor the work he had done. Marc's decision was his way of honoring it in his own way. The power of acceptance. Through this journey, André Rieu learned the power of acceptance. He learned that to truly love someone, you must let them go. Not just physically, but emotionally. He had built a world of music, of celebration, of grand orchestras and roaring crowds. But the truest, most emotional performance he had ever witnessed was his son choosing to live a life on his own terms. Marc's transformation was not just about stepping away from music. It was about stepping into himself. And André, though initially heartbroken, began to understand that his greatest role as a father was not to demand that Marc follow in his footsteps, but to support him in finding his own way, wherever it led. The end of a chapter, the start of a new one. The tears André Rieu shed were not tears of regret, but of quiet pride. He was proud of the man his son was becoming. He was proud of the choices Marc had made, even though they were difficult for him to accept at first. And most of all, he was proud of the fact that, despite the legacy he had built, his son was strong enough to create his own path. In many ways, this was the most profound victory André Rieu could ever claim. Not for his music, but for his family, for his son. Marc's journey was only beginning, and in his own quiet way, André Rieu had played the most important role in that journey. Not as a maestro leading an orchestra, but as a father letting his son conduct his own life. A legacy reimagined. For André Rieu, the real meaning of legacy had changed. It was no longer about creating something that could be inherited, something that could live on forever. It was about creating the space for someone else to have their own life, their own dreams, their own future. The world may have expected Marc to follow in his father's footsteps, but in the end, it was André's ability to let go that defined his true legacy. His greatest accomplishment was not the concerts, the albums, or the millions of fans. It was the quiet, loving decision to let his son choose his own path. And in that choice, André Rieu understood that the true measure of a legacy is not in how long it lasts, but in how deeply it allows others to live. As time passed, André Rieu found himself reflecting not just on his career, but on the impact his choices had made on his family, especially Marc. The tears that once signaled his sorrow slowly transformed into something much more profound: acceptance. And acceptance wasn't just about embracing Marc's decision to walk away from the spotlight. It was about recognizing that true love, true legacy, is not about possession, but about freedom. The quiet strength of a father's love. Though the world saw André Rieu as a symbol of strength and control, few understood the emotional vulnerability hidden beneath his public persona. He had spent his life commanding an orchestra, meticulously crafting every note, every arrangement, ensuring that the world witnessed his mastery. But no amount of fame, no number of accolades, could have prepared him for the emotional complexity of letting go of his son's future. For years, André had shaped his legacy to be something that would endure, something his family could be proud of. But Marc's decision to step away was an act of courage, not defiance, but a quiet assertion of his own identity. And in that moment, André realized that true strength wasn't in holding on to the past, but in letting go of it. The weight of a family's expectations. Family expectations can be as heavy as 1,000 notes played on a violin, and André Rieu understood this more than anyone. He had always believed that his sons would inherit his love for music, that his artistic world would continue in their hands, that the family's name would live on through their passion for performance. But as Marc grew older, it became clear that the weight of his father's fame was not a gift, but a burden. And while André had always been proud of his success, he realized that the pressures he had placed on his own shoulders had unintentionally been transferred to his children. Legacy, when it becomes a chain, can keep the ones we love trapped rather than free. Marc's transformation was not a rejection of family, but a courageous attempt to break free from the expectations that came with his surname. And this realization hit André harder than any performance or standing ovation ever could. It was a quiet, humbling lesson in the fragility of parental love. Love does not force. Love lets go. Understanding Marc's journey. The beauty of Marc's journey was that it wasn't one of rebellion, but self-discovery. He did not need to seek fame in the same way his father had. He did not need to follow in André's footsteps to prove his worth. Marc was carving his own path, one that was less about the applause of strangers and more about the inner peace of being true to oneself. It's easy to assume that stepping away from the limelight means rejection of family, of tradition, of everything that came before. But Marc's decision to build his own life away from his father's shadow was an act of courage. It was not about abandoning music. It was about redefining how that music would be part of his life. And André, though initially devastated by the thought of losing his son to a different world, began to understand that Marc's decision wasn't about distancing himself from his family. It was about finding his own voice in the world without the noise of expectation. The unspoken truth about legacy. Legacy is often viewed as something to be passed on, a gift to the next generation. But what André Rieu began to understand, through Marc's decision, is that legacy is not about perpetuating the past. It's about creating space for future generations to reimagine it. Marc's transformation was not just an evolution of his own life. It was a redefinition of what family, legacy, and success meant. André had always believed that his music would be his legacy, that the empire he built would stand as a testament to his life's work. But as he watched his son choose a path of his own, André realized that his true legacy was not the music or the fame. It was the freedom to choose one's own path. This was the turning point for André. True legacy is not found in repetition, but in the courage to change, letting go and moving forward. For André, the idea of letting go was never easy. He was used to being in control, used to commanding the stage, the orchestra, and the narrative of his own life. But this moment, the realization that his son had chosen a different path, was one that required him to let go of the illusion of control. At first, it felt like a loss, an unraveling of the life he had built. But with time, André came to see it as something else, an opportunity for growth, both for himself and for Marc. Marc's transformation wasn't a betrayal. It was an act of self-empowerment, something André had never truly understood until he saw it in action. Letting go wasn't about abandoning his legacy. It was about embracing it in a new, more profound way. André Rieu didn't need to own his son's future to be proud of it. He didn't need Marc to follow his path to know that his life had meant something. In fact, the greatest victory André could claim was knowing that his son had the strength to create his own destiny. A father's final reflection. As the years passed, André Rieu's legacy continued to be celebrated. His concerts, his music, his influence all remained a permanent fixture in the world of classical music. But the true measure of his legacy and the true measure of his success could no longer be found in the size of the arenas he filled, the albums he sold, or the fans who adored him. It was found in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his son was free to live his own life, without the weight of inherited expectations. André's greatest lesson, the one that had taken him a lifetime to learn, was that freedom is the truest form of love. And while his music would forever echo in the halls of history, it was the love between father and son, the ability to let go and to support each other, that would truly define their legacy. In the end, André Rieu realized that his son's transformation was not an end, but a new beginning. For Marc, for himself, and for their family. As the years continued to unfold, the world saw less of André Rieu on stage, but in that absence, a new kind of fulfillment began to take root. He no longer needed to conduct every performance, to lead every orchestra, or to make every note perfect. He had come to realize that the legacy of a person isn't measured by how long their name echoes in the concert halls, but by the freedom they give those they love to walk their own paths. The unseen power of quiet legacy. For years, André Rieu had viewed his own life through the lens of ambition. His career, his success, his orchestras, and his performances had defined his every action. And while he always cared deeply for his family, there was an underlying sense of duty to his craft, an unspoken belief that his legacy would live on through the works he created, the music he composed, and the empire he built. But Marc's decision to step away was a reminder that true legacy isn't a monument to oneself. It's about creating space for those you love to grow, evolve, and find their own way. André's journey, full of grand gestures and public triumphs, had at times obscured the quieter moments that truly matter, the moments of reflection, the gentle letting go, and the acceptance that comes when you realize that the most important thing you can do for someone else is to free them from the weight of your expectations. The struggle of a father's heart. It's difficult for any parent to watch their child struggle, but for someone like André, who had spent decades in the spotlight, the pain of seeing Marc step away was compounded by the idea that he might have failed his son in some way. His mind began to churn with questions. Had he pushed Marc too hard? Had he unknowingly set him up for a life in the shadows of his own success? Was his son walking away because of something he had done, or something he hadn't done? But over time, André came to understand that these questions were born not out of regret, but out of the love he felt for Marc. He realized that, as much as he wanted his son to share in his world, he could never force that upon him. Marc's decision wasn't a rejection. It was simply his own way of asserting his right to live a life unbound by the shadow of his father's legacy. And in that realization, André found something truly liberating. The ability to truly love someone unconditionally means allowing them to be their own person. Acceptance as the ultimate act of love. The concept of acceptance had always been foreign to André. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on control over the music, over the performances, over the narrative of his life. But Marc's decision to go his own way was an awakening. It was a lesson in letting go of expectations, letting go of the need to control, letting go of the desire for validation. In the years that followed, André began to see Marc not as the child who had turned away from a famous legacy, but as the person he was meant to become. The tears André had shed in the early days of Marc's decision were replaced with a quiet pride. Pride not in what Marc had done, but in who he had become, someone who had the strength to define his own identity, free from the burden of family fame. André's journey, as a father, was no longer about seeing his son follow in his footsteps, but about witnessing Marc walk confidently down a path of his own. And in that, André found peace. True love, he realized, was found in the freedom to choose your own destiny. The end of the public performance. The last few years of André's career were quieter, more reflective. While he still performed on occasion, it was no longer with the same drive to prove himself, to leave behind a greater legacy. He no longer felt the need to fill every concert hall or win every accolade. Instead, he began to focus on what truly mattered: his family, his health, and the time he had left to experience life outside the confines of his public persona. As Marc continued to live his life outside of the spotlight, André found himself reconnecting with the parts of his life that had once been overshadowed by fame. He spent more time at home, enjoying the simple pleasures of life: family dinners, quiet afternoons, and the joy of hearing his grandchildren play. He realized that the music would always be there, but the moments with those he loved were fleeting. A new chapter, a different legacy. Marc's transformation had marked a turning point in both of their lives. It was not just a moment of separation. It was a rebirth for André. He was no longer just the conductor of an orchestra. He was a father who had learned the true meaning of legacy. That legacy is not about what you leave behind, but what you give the freedom to live. In the final years of his life, André embraced the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that his family, in their own way, would carry his love for music forward, even if they chose different paths. The music would continue to echo through the halls, but it would do so on Marc's terms, not as an heir to a legacy, but as a man who had found his own way. André had given his son the greatest gift a father could give, the freedom to live life on his own terms. And in that, he found the true meaning of legacy, a legacy not defined by fame, but by love, by acceptance, and by the courage to let go. Full circle, the music lives on. In the end, André Rieu's legacy wasn't just the sound of his orchestra playing in grand concert halls. It was in the understanding that true legacy isn't something you force upon the next generation. It's something you offer them the chance to redefine. Marc Rieu's life, his choices, and his journey became an integral part of André's story. And though the world may never hear Marc's name sung by thousands in arenas, his life was, in its own way, a testament to André's true legacy, one of love, freedom, and the courage to let go. As André continued to reflect on his life, he knew that no matter what came next, his legacy would never be defined by the number of records sold or the awards won. It would be defined by the love that surrounded him, by the family he had nurtured, the music he had shared, and the freedom he had finally granted his son. As André Rieu's public career waned and his personal life took center stage, the world around him seemed to blur into a quieter, more contemplative existence. The grand orchestras, the applause, the countless performances were all behind him now, but the echoes of his music remained. They weren't just in the halls or the recordings, but in his heart and in the way he had come to appreciate the simpler moments in life. But through it all, one thing became clear. The true transformation wasn't just Marc's decision to walk away from the legacy of music. It was André himself who had transformed. And this transformation was something even he hadn't expected, rediscovering purpose beyond the spotlight. For a man like André, who had spent most of his life in the limelight, being thrust into the shadows was not an easy shift. But as he came to terms with Marc's choices, he started to see his life from a different perspective. The spotlight, which had once been all-consuming, no longer held the same allure. Instead, he began to rediscover the joy of life without the constant pressure of being someone the world expected him to be. For years, he had seen himself through the lens of his career, his orchestra, his persona as the king of the waltz. But now, as the applause faded and the tours became less frequent, André saw himself as something else, a father, a grandfather, and a man who had lived a full life. He no longer needed to prove himself to anyone. Instead, he began to ask himself a much more important question. What truly matters to me now? André began to focus on the things that had always been there, quietly, in the background. His family, his loved ones, and his passion for the music that had always brought him peace. He no longer needed the validation of packed arenas to feel complete. The real reward was the life he had built with those closest to him, a life that wasn't defined by his public achievements, but by the love he shared with his family. The gift of time, embracing the quiet moments. As his son Marc settled into his own life, André found himself spending more time at home, surrounded by those who mattered most. The whirlwind of tours and rehearsals had always left little room for the simple joys of life. Quiet conversations, shared meals, and the gentle rhythm of everyday living. But now, André took pleasure in the moments that had once felt insignificant, but were, in fact, the foundation of what mattered most. He spent afternoons with Marc, not talking about music or fame, but about life, the joys and struggles, the quiet victories, and the challenges that came with being true to oneself. And in those moments, André saw his son not as the heir to a legacy, but as a man who was finally living his own life, fully and authentically. The music would always be part of André's life, but he realized that the greatest gift was the time he could now spend with his family, away from the spotlight. He had lived his life in service of his art, but now he understood that the true art was in the connections he had nurtured with those he loved. Marc's journey, a father's pride. Over time, André began to see Marc's decision to step away from the public life as a beautiful expression of courage. It wasn't a rejection of his family or his upbringing. It was a choice to live life on his own terms, free from the expectations of the world around him. And André, despite the initial heartbreak, couldn't help but feel immense pride in his son's strength. Marc had found a way to build a life that was uniquely his without being shackled by the weight of his father's fame. He had the freedom to define his path, and in doing so, he was honoring the very essence of what André had always hoped for him, the freedom to choose. André Rieu's pride in Marc wasn't measured by the career Marc chose, but by the man he had become. He was a man who had the strength to stand on his own, to create his own identity, and to live a life that was true to himself. That, more than anything, was the ultimate measure of success. A legacy of freedom and love. In the end, André Rieu realized that legacy was not something that could be inherited like a set of musical scores or a well-maintained empire. Legacy was about creating the space for others to be who they truly were, without the pressure of living up to expectations. The love he had shared with Marc, and with his entire family, was the legacy he had been building all along, a legacy that would live on in the choices his children made, the lives they led, and the love they passed on. As André watched Marc find his own way in the world, he understood that the most important thing he could offer his son was the freedom to live without the weight of his success on his shoulders. And in return, Marc had given André the greatest gift of all, the gift of seeing his son as an individual, a man in his own right, rather than a continuation of his own legacy. For André, this was a powerful lesson in humility and love. The music would always remain a part of him, but the love he had for his family was the true melody that would echo through the ages, reflecting on the fullness of a life well lived. As the years continued to pass, André found peace in the knowledge that his life had been rich, not because of the accolades or the fame, but because of the people he had loved and who had loved him in return. His music, his career, and his legacy were important, yes, but they were not the defining elements of who he was. The true measure of his life was in the relationships he had nurtured, the quiet moments, the heartfelt conversations, the unconditional love he had given and received. The music would fade, as all things eventually do, but love, real, unconditional love, was the song that would never stop playing. And in the final years of his life, André Rieu found solace in the knowledge that he had created a legacy that was far more enduring than anything he could have imagined, a legacy of freedom, love, and the courage to let go. As André Rieu's life continued to evolve, so did the way he viewed the world. The man who had once been so consumed with his public image and legacy was now deeply connected to the quieter, more intimate moments that made life truly meaningful. He had achieved something far greater than fame, a sense of peace that came from knowing that his legacy wasn't something to be preserved, but something to be experienced, lived, and shared. The final performance, a personal concert. André knew his time in the limelight was coming to an end, and he had made peace with it. But his final performances weren't about saying goodbye to the world. They were about celebrating the personal growth that had come with accepting his journey, his family, and his son's transformation. Marc, once part of his world, had now found his own, and André couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in that. The final concert wasn't marked by fanfare, massive productions, or spectacle. It was an intimate affair, a solo performance. Just him, his violin, and the soft, echoing sounds of the melodies that had shaped his entire life. His orchestra wasn't by his side. There was no grand orchestra hall or standing ovation. Instead, it was just André in his most vulnerable form, playing the music that had always been his companion, now reflecting on his journey, both as a musician and as a father. The music was softer than usual, but it carried with it a depth of emotion that words could never convey. In the quiet, intimate performance, André realized something profound, that the music wasn't just his legacy. It was a reflection of the freedom he had allowed his family to experience. His ability to let go of control had allowed for a new kind of harmony, one that resonated not just in concert halls, but within the heart of his family. The beauty of letting go. Letting go. It had been one of the hardest lessons for André to learn, yet it had brought him the most peace. For much of his life, André had clung to the idea of building something that could stand the test of time, something that would outlast him. But as Marc carved out his own future, André began to see that true legacy doesn't need to be controlled. His son's transformation was a living testament to the beauty of freedom. Marc's decision to pursue his own life, separate from the world of fame and music that had shaped his father's existence, was a decision that André learned to respect and honor. And in that respect, he found a deep sense of pride. André's tears, once filled with sorrow and regret, were now tears of acceptance and love. They symbolized his recognition that, while he had created something magnificent in his career, it was his family's ability to stand on their own that would define his true legacy. The true meaning of family. As the years went by, André began to shift his focus from his public persona to his family's personal lives. Marc, now thriving in his own endeavors, had built a life that was uniquely his, and André couldn't help but admire the man his son had become. What had initially seemed like a loss, a moment of separation, had turned into a deeper connection, one rooted in respect and understanding. André's journey had not only been about becoming an artist, but about learning to be a father in a way that allowed his children to find their own path, without the weight of his success bearing down on them. The bond between father and son grew stronger, not because they had shared the same stage or the same career, but because they had learned to embrace each other's independence. The beauty of their relationship lay in the mutual respect they held for one another's choices. The quiet joy of acceptance. In the final years of his life, André Rieu found joy in the quiet moments that had once been overshadowed by his career. He no longer needed to prove himself to the world. The only thing that mattered now was the time he spent with his loved ones. It was no longer about the grand performances or the admiration of millions. It was about the small, quiet joys of life. The laughter of his grandchildren, the conversations with Marc that didn't involve music, and the simple pleasure of being together without the weight of public expectations. In letting go of his career and the need to be constantly in the spotlight, André found a deeper connection with his family. He had spent years trying to create a legacy, but in the end, he realized that his true legacy was found in the love he shared with those closest to him. The music would always be a part of him, but it was the relationships he had cultivated that would continue to echo in the hearts of his family. The legacy of love. As André Rieu's life neared its final chapter, he looked back with gratitude, not for the applause, but for the love that had surrounded him. He had created something beautiful in his music, but the greatest beauty was found in the moments he had spent with those he loved, particularly Marc. Marc's transformation had taught André that legacy is not something that can be inherited or forced. It's something that is freely chosen. It's not about creating a mold for someone to fit into, but about allowing them to live their life in a way that is true to themselves. In this final realization, André found a deep sense of peace. He no longer needed to worry about how he would be remembered. What mattered was that his family had the freedom to live their own lives, to create their own legacies, and to be happy. A final farewell. André Rieu's final farewell wasn't marked by grandeur, but by a quiet, heartfelt moment of reflection. He had spent a lifetime building something extraordinary, but the most extraordinary thing he had built was the love and freedom he had given his family. As he put down his violin for the last time, André understood that the true beauty of music lies not in the notes that fill the air, but in the moments of silence that allow those notes to breathe. His music would continue to live on, not just in his recordings, but in the hearts of those he had loved and who had loved him. And so, André Rieu's legacy wasn't defined by the crowds he played for, the awards he won, or the records he sold. It was defined by the quiet love he had cultivated, the family he had raised, and the freedom he had given his son. And in that, he found the true meaning of a life well lived.